Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Blu Mindz podcast. I'm your host, Blu Baby. If you're new here, welcome. Before we get started, I want to say something that's really important. Today's episode is a little different. I wanted to take a deeper dive into a topic that's making headlines, but honestly, in my opinion, I don't think it has received enough attention or explanation that it really truly deserves. Everything that we'll discuss today is based on publicly available information at the time of this recording. The proposal that I'll be talking about, it has not been finalized, so I encourage each and every one of you to go out there and do your own research, like read multiple perspectives and come up with your own conclusions and let me know what you think. Because this isn't about telling you what to think, it's about giving you something to think about. Because I believe one of the healthiest things that we can ever do for ourselves and for our communities is to stay curious. I was always that curious child coming up, always asking questions. Today, I want to start off by asking you a question. What happens when we stop measuring something? For an example, you have a doctor's appointment. So you go to your doctor's appointment and you're expecting a blood pressure check as always. So the doctor comes in and say that today we won't be checking your blood pressure because for one, it costs too much. And for two, checking your blood pressure in one day, it doesn't give us the entire story. The doctor is right about that. It doesn't give us the whole story, but it gives us information. It lets us know to look into something a little more. It helps us to understand more about our health and where we are. So recently, I came across a proposal involving the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, that would eliminate one longstanding workplace reporting requirement, and it's known as the EEO1 demographic report. Let me explain to you what that report is. The report is an annual workforce report submitted to the EEOC by private employers with at least 100 employees and by certain federal contractors that meet lower employee and contract thresholds. The employers report the number of workers and they report it in different job categories that's grouped by race or ethnicity and sex. So the report does not contain a public list naming individual employees, but it does provide aggregated workforce information. So that means that the government can actually look at the categories and patterns and not read a public document that says exactly where a specific employee works or what that individual earns. The current EEO1 system does not cover every worker or every employee in the United States. Most small businesses are excluded. Independent contractors and self-employed people are not represented in the same way. So much of that gig economy is outside of the actual report. So this is not a complete census of every workplace in America, and it definitely is not worldwide data. So this is an American workforce data collected for certain covered employers. But that limitation matters because data can be useful without being complete. So a sample of that can help us understand patterns. What this report does is that it divides workers into broad job categories. Like these categories might include positions like executives or professionals. But again, those numbers do not automatically prove discrimination. So let me say that clearly. A demographic imbalance does not by itself prove that an employer discriminated against anyone. So as I was reading the proposal, at first I thought it was just another policy change. But then the more I read about it, the more questions I had, not because the issue is simple, because it's definitely not. There's two very different perspectives. Let's first start off by talking about the person who's leading this proposal. Her name is Andrea Lucas, and she has served on EEOC since 2020. She was originally nominated by President Donald Trump. She was nominated during his first term, and then she was reconfirmed by the Senate in 2025 And then she was later designated by the chair of the EEOC in November of 2025. So Chair Lucas argues that civil rights laws should protect people as individuals, so not as groups, as individuals. From her perspective, government policy should not encourage employers to view workers primarily through racial or sex-based categories. She also stated that the Democratic reports would be consistent with Title VII and with the principle that every individual is entitled to equal opportunity under law. So before we go any further, let's talk about what Title VII is. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it makes it illegal for employers to discriminate in hiring, firing, pay, promotion, or any other employment terms based on their race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Now, her position raised several arguments, and one of the first ones is the administrative burden placed on employers. She said that preparing and submitting reports require time, technology. Another one of her points is that demographic reporting can encourage employers to focus too heavily on outcomes based on race or sex, and I think that that's needed. Some people fear that when the companies are evaluated by demographic percentages or decision makers, they may begin considering an applicant's race or sex as an attempt to produce a desired statistical result. You have one side where there's people who believe removing this requirement could reduce paperwork, lower costs for employers, and keep the focus on evaluating individuals based on their qualifications rather than their demographic categories. So that's the overall thought. And so now we have the person that opposed to Andrea Lucas' proposal, and her name is Kalpana Kotagal, and I hope I'm saying that name right. She's the Democratic commissioner who voted against advancing that proposal. She is an employment and civil rights attorney who has represented workers in cases involving discrimination, disability rights, and other workplace issues. And she was nominated, I believe, in August of 2023 to the commission by President Joe Biden. So Commissioner Kotagal and other opponents of the proposal believe that these reports are really, really important tools for civil rights enforcement, because their position is that individual complaints alone may not reveal systemic problems. One employee may believe that she was passed over for a promotion. This is an example. And another employee in a different location might believe the same exact thing, but that third employee may leave without filing a complaint. So viewed separately, the experiences may appear unrelated. Understand? But broader workforce data might reveal that a particular group is consistently concentrated in lower level positions while rarely appearing in leadership. Once again, the pattern would not prove discrimination, but without data, investigators may never know that the pattern even exists. On that side, there are people who argue that without broad workforce data, it becomes more difficult to identify those long-term trends. It becomes difficult to identify study patterns and understand whether opportunities are expanding or whether they're shrinking for different groups over time. So those are two very different perspectives, as I stated, and both of them deserve to be understood before we actually rush to conclusions. I'm not asking you to pick a side, but I am inviting you to ask you some better questions. Questions like, why was this reporting requirement created in the first place? First, you have to understand why the document was created to get a really better understanding and be able to respond. If this reporting requirement changes, what information might still be available and what might become more difficult for us to see? And perhaps the biggest question of them all that I had was, how do we build systems that are fair, transparent, and practical for everyone that's involved? Because regardless of where you stand politically. Most Americans want the same basic things. We want opportunity, fairness, and we want businesses to succeed. We want employees to be treated with dignity. And we want confidence that the systems that we rely on are working just as they're intended. So if you're ready, let's start at the beginning, because to understand why this conversation matters today, we have to first understand how it all began. So why America started measuring. So, one of the things I've learned over the years is that if you really want to understand today's headlines, sometimes you have to go back into history. So that's what I did, because history gave me a lot more context, and context helped me to avoid jumping to conclusions. Let's rewind the clock back for a moment. And let's go back to 1964. America looked very different than it does today. The country was in the middle of civil rights movement. People were marching in the streets. Communities were demanding equal treatment under the law. Remember, there were powerful conversations happening about race, opportunity, fairness, conversations that changed the course of American history. So out of that movement came one of the most important pieces of civil rights legislation ever passed, and that was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So one section of that law, which is Title VII, made it illegal for employers to discriminate against someone because of their race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. That was a major turning point. But passing a law and enforcing a law are two very different things. So I want you to think about it that way moving forward. Imagine a city passes a law, right? And they're saying that every neighborhood should have clean drinking water. So that's an important first step. But how do you know if the law is actually working? That's the question. So you'll have to inspect the water. You'll have to test it. You have to collect some information, because without that information, it's difficult to know whether the goal is actually being achieved. And so that is the very same principle applied to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, to help enforce federal workplace discrimination laws. Its mission was not to hire people, it wasn't to fire people, and it wasn't even to tell private companies who they had to employ. Let's be clear. The role was to simply investigate discrimination complaints, to enforce federal law, and to help ensure that employment decisions compile with the protections established by Congress. So over time, one of the tools used to better understand the workforce was the EEO1 report, the very one that we were rescinding. So now let's clear up a common misunderstanding. The EEO1 report, it doesn't contain personal stories. It doesn't tell anyone whether specific hiring decisions was fair, or it doesn't even say if it was unfair, but instead it is an anonymous summary of a company's workforce by one, job category, by race, ethnicity, and sex. So it's designed to provide a broader picture. It's important to understand who has to file these reports, because not every business in America does. Generally speaking, the requirement applies to larger employers. Typically, private employers with like 100 or more employees, and certain federal contractors that meet that specific threshold under the federal rules. So that means that millions of small businesses across the country had never filed an EEO1 report. When people talk about ending this reporting requirement, they're talking about a reporting system that applies to a specific group of employers, but not every business in America, because I want you to completely understand what's going on here. So another thing that's important to remember is this. The EEO1 report has never been intended to prove discrimination. Data can reveal patterns, and patterns can raise questions, but questions still require investigation. So for an example, if a hospital noticed that a patient outcomes suddenly change, the numbers alone won't explain why. The data would simply tell them it's time to look more closely. So it's like that warning, like that indicator. Workforce data can highlight trends that deserve additional review, but it doesn't automatically tell us what caused those trends. And that's an important distinction because sometimes public conversations treat data as if it's a final answer, but it's not. Data is only the starting point. It's gathering information. It helps us to ask better questions. As I researched this topic, I realized something that really surprised me. Many people talking about this proposal seem to assume that the debate is about whether discrimination should be illegal, but that's not actually what's being debated. Federal laws prohibiting employment discrimination remain in place. Employees are still expected to comply with those laws. Whether they do or not, that's another story. But employees can still file complaints if they believe they've been discriminated against. But the real debate is really something different. It's about whether this particular type of nationwide workforce reporting continues to be the best way to gather information. That's a very different conversation here. Once I understood that, I realized something else. It's a debate about how fairness should be measured. And that's where the story becomes much, much more interesting because the people leading this discussion aren't necessarily disagreeing about the destination. They're disagreeing about the role that get us there. You know, after I finished reading everything that I could find about this proposal, I closed my laptop. Not because I found all the answers, because I have not found all the answers, but because I realized I had found something that was even more valuable, and that's questions. And I don't know about you, but I've learned that the quality of our lives often depends on the quality of the questions we're willing to ask. So sometimes we're so busy looking for quick answers that we never stop long enough to ask whether we're asking the right questions in the first place. And so that's really important too, asking the right questions. And that's where I found myself. So instead of asking who's right, who's wrong, I started asking like, what am I missing here? The first question that came to mind was simple. Why now? The EEO1 reporting requirement has existed in some form for decades. It survived changes in administration, changes in Congress, economic recessions, booming job markets, political shifts. So why is the conversation happening now? What has changed? Has technology made the reporting system outdated? Has it become too expensive? Has it stopped providing useful information? Or has our understanding of the workplace fairness evolved? Those are really important questions because if you're going to change a system that's been around for decades, people naturally want to understand why. Because here's something I believe, very few systems are perfect, right? So our healthcare system, that's by no means perfect. Our education system is not perfect. Our justice system. But when we find weaknesses, we usually ask how to improve on them, not do away with it completely. So I started wondering, could technology make reporting easier? Can AI reduce paperwork? Could employers securely submit anonymous information without spending weeks preparing reports? Like, how can we reduce that burden? That was Andrea Lucas' concern, is reducing the burden. Could we create dashboards that automatically update while protecting individual privacy? Those questions fascinated me because maybe this isn't a choice between keeping an old system and throwing it away, but maybe there's a third option, trust. Then I arrived at the question that really stayed with me. And the one thing I kept thinking about long after I stopped reading, how can we as Americans have confidence that the most qualified person is being chosen? And I'm going to let you think about that for a second. Now, let me be clear. Being qualified isn't determined by race. It's not determined by sex. It's not determined by ethnicity. Qualifications come from knowledge, experience. It comes from skill, character, and the ability to actually do the job. So I think most of us can agree on that, right? But confidence in a system is something that's totally different. Confidence comes from believing the process is fair. Here's another example. Think about sports. Imagine watching a championship game of your favorite sport. Halfway through the game, the referees decided they're not going to keep the score anymore. So the players, they keep on playing, the rules stay the same, but nobody knows what the score is. So will fans have confidence in the outcome? Probably not. Not because anyone cheated, but because transparency builds trust. I'm not comparing hiring to a scoreboard. People are not numbers. Every applicant is an individual. Every hiring decision involves unique circumstances. So my point is much simpler. And in almost every part of life, we tend to trust systems more than we understand how they're working. One thing that I kept reminding myself while I was researching this topic is that numbers, they have limits. Data can reveal patterns. It cannot tell us motives. So data can point us toward questions. It cannot answer every question. For an example, if a company hires more engineers than another, the numbers alone can't explain why. So maybe one company expanded, maybe another downsized, maybe fewer people applied, maybe qualifications differed. The data doesn't tell the entire story. That's why it's imperative not to overstate what workforce reporting can do. It doesn't prove discrimination, fairness. It doesn't tell us whether one hiring decision was right or wrong. It simply provides one piece of a much larger puzzle. So there's more to know. Then I went back to where we started. What happened when we stopped measuring, right? So do problems disappear? Do they become much difficult to study? Honestly, I don't know the perfect answer. And I'm okay with admitting that. Sometimes leadership is having the humility to say, here's what I know, and here's what I think we should keep exploring together. That's when something clicked for me. Maybe the better question is this: what would a smarter system look like today? I'll tell you, a system that protects privacy, reduces unnecessary paperwork, uses modern technology, that provides meaningful workforce information, that builds public confidence, and respects both employers and employees. Because if we've learned anything over the last 60 years, it's that America changes. Technology changes, workplaces changes, the workforce changes. Maybe our systems should evolve too. Let's imagine what that future could actually look like, not based on politics, fear, but based on innovation, transparency, and common sense. As I reflected on everything that I have learned, I stopped asking whether we should keep the current system exactly as it is or eliminate it completely. Instead, I started looking at it from a different perspective. What would we build if we were designing it today? Technology has changed dramatically, as I stated, since the EEO1 report was first introduced in 1966. Today, we use secure cloud systems, digital payroll platforms, and AI to simplify tasks that once took hours or even days to do. So maybe the conversation isn't simply about collecting, less information. Maybe it's about collecting it more efficiently. Imagine a system that protects employee privacy, that reduces that paperwork for employers, and still provides meaningful workforce information through secure, modern technology. Would that better serve both employers and employees? To me, progress isn't about holding on to every old system because, as we all know, systems evolve. Real progress happens when we're willing to improve what already exists. So maybe that's the opportunity that we have in front of us. When I started researching this topic, I thought I was learning about one government reporting requirement. But by the time I finished, I realized I was learning about something much more bigger. One thing I've learned from working in clinical research is that good decisions begin with good questions. Researchers don't ignore information because it's inconvenient. Let me tell you, they study it and they study it carefully, recognize the limits, and keep searching for better answers. I think the same mindset can help us in our everyday life, whether we're talking about our health, our finances, our career, or public policy. Measurement isn't about assigning blame. It's about understanding where we are so we can make informed decisions. After listening to Acting Chair Andrea Lucas's perspective, and after considering Commissioner Kalpana Kotagal's concerns, I came away with one conclusion. This debate isn't simply about data. It's about balancing efficiency, privacy, accountability, and public confidence. I'm Blu Baby, and this has been the BluMindz podcast. Keep asking questions, keep learning, keep growing, and don't be afraid to change your mind when new information comes along. That's what makes a person intelligent. You got to be open-minded. You can't stay closed-minded, because an informed mind is an empowered mind. Empowered people make stronger communities. Take care.